The message came from somewhere beyond the stars, and nobody on Earth had ever seen anything like it before. The symbols and patterns took 3 weeks to decode using every computer and every smart person humanity could find. When they finally understood what it said, everyone in the government building went quiet because the message was an invitation. Aliens wanted to meet with humans at a place far away in space, and they called it a peace meeting. Commander. Jake Morrison read the message again while standing in the control room of the ESS Horizon, which was Earth's newest and best ship, built just for traveling to other stars and meeting whatever might be out there. He had been a soldier for 15 years and fought in 3 wars on Earth, but nothing in his training prepared him for this moment. Lieutenant Sophie Banks sat at her station watching dozens of screens that connected them back to Earth, and she said she couldn't believe aliens actually wanted to talk to humans. Captain Derek Hayes was older, with gray hair and tired eyes, and he said the aliens didn't want to talk but wanted to give humans an order, and there was a big difference between those two things. Jake agreed with the captain, because something about the message felt wrong even though the words seemed friendly. Humans had been traveling faster than light for only 18 months, and in all that time they found old ruins and empty cities on dead planets, but never once did they meet another living creature from another world until this message arrived. The navigation officer announced they would reach the meeting place in 2 hours, and all the ship systems were working perfectly, and the diplomatic team was getting ready in the conference room. Ambassador Claire Watson led the team, and she spent 30 years making peace between countries on Earth before getting this job to speak for all humans to whatever waited at those coordinates in space. Jake thought she was smart and brave, but she learned how to deal with humans, not aliens. Captain Hayes told Jake to go with the ambassador because he had combat experience and diplomatic training, and most importantly, he could think fast when things went bad. Jake said the ambassador might not want him watching over her shoulder, but Hayes said peace meetings could turn into fights and someone needed to watch everyone else in that room. Jake walked through the ship's hallways toward the conference room and past crew members, who tried not to look scared because everyone knew what was happening. Humanity was about to meet neighbors they never knew existed, and those neighbors had technology good enough to send messages across light years, which meant they had been flying through space far longer than Earth's 18 months. The big question keeping everyone awake was simple. If aliens had been out here all along, why were they only contacting humans now? Ambassador Watson was reading reports when Jake entered, and she looked up with calm eyes even though he could see the stress underneath. She asked if the captain sent him, and Jake said yes. Watson nodded and said she could use someone who knew how to spot danger because all her training was in spotting political advantage. They sat together reviewing everything humans knew about what waited for them, which wasn't much. The message came from something called the Galactic Council that apparently represented many different species, and the meeting would happen on a space station at the coordinates they were approaching, and humans could send only 5 representatives. Watson asked Jake what he thought the aliens wanted, and he said honestly he believed Captain Hayes was right. He thought this was about setting boundaries because humans had stumbled into someone's neighborhood, and the aliens wanted to make sure humans understood the rules. Watson asked what would happen if humans didn't like their rules, and Jake looked at her steadily and said then humans would have to decide how badly they wanted to stay in the neighborhood. The hour passed too quickly, and soon the intercom announced they had arrived at the coordinates, and there was visual confirmation of the station. Jake pulled up the video feed on the conference room screen, and his breath stopped in his throat because the station was massive. It hung in space like something impossible, with rings inside, rings and spheres connected by structures that looked too thin to be real, and at the center was something that might be a docking area or might be something else entirely. Lights pulsed across its surface in patterns that looked like communication, or maybe just decoration. Watson whispered that it was beautiful, but Jake said quietly that it was a show of force because the aliens were demonstrating what they could do before humans even sat down at the table. A new message appeared on the screen in perfect English saying the vessel from Earth was cleared for docking at Port 7 and should proceed slowly because any deviation from the path would be considered hostile action. Captain Hayes announced over the speakers that they were going in and told the ambassador and Jake to prepare their team because they would launch in the shuttle as soon as they docked. Jake checked his weapon automatically, then caught himself because bringing guns might make the aliens angry. Watson watched him and said to leave it because if the aliens wanted to kill them, A pistol wouldn't make a difference, but showing up armed might be the excuse they needed. She was right, so Jake took off his holster and left the weapon on the conference room table. 20 minutes later, Jake sat in a shuttle with Ambassador Watson and 3 other team members, including Dr. Helen Price, who was a scientist studying alien life, Commander Luis Garcia, who was an engineer who could understand alien technology, and Lieutenant Emma Foster, who spoke 19 Earth languages and helped decode the original message. The shuttle detached from the horizon and began moving toward the alien station, and through the window, Jake could see the structure getting bigger and its impossible shape becoming even clearer. There were no straight lines anywhere, and everything curved and spiraled in ways that suggested aliens thought about building differently than humans did. The pilot announced they were receiving docking instructions, and the aliens were guiding them in with a tractor beam, and humans had lost control of the ship. Watson said calmly to stay steady because this was expected, and the aliens were demonstrating their control of the situation, even though Jake could see her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. The shuttle was pulled into an opening that appeared in the station's surface, and suddenly they were inside, surrounded by a hangar that could hold 20 ships the size of the horizon. The shuttle settled onto a platform, and Jake heard the hiss of air being pumped into the bay. Lieutenant Foster checked her instruments and reported the atmosphere was breathable with slightly higher oxygen than Earth normal, but within acceptable parameters, and the temperature was comfortable, and the aliens had prepared the environment for humans. Jake muttered that maybe this was their standard environment, and humans were just lucky. The boarding ramp extended, and Ambassador Watson stood and reminded her team to listen first and speak second, because they represented all of humanity in this moment, and they shouldn't give aliens any reason to regret inviting them. They walked down the ramp together, and Jake's hand moved toward where his weapon would have been before he remembered he left it behind. The hangar was empty except for their shuttle and a single door at the far end that was 3 times taller than a human. As they approached, the door opened silently, revealing a corridor beyond, and the walls glowed with soft light that seemed to come from living things, and the floor changed its texture under their feet to give perfect grip. A voice said in perfect English to follow the corridor to the council chamber, though Jake couldn't tell where the voice came from. The voice also said they were the last to arrive. That stopped them all cold because it meant there were others already there, which meant other species and other civilizations. They were not alone, and they were about to find out just how crowded the neighborhood really was. The corridor seemed to go on forever, with walls displaying patterns that might be decoration or might be written language. Every few meters they passed intersections where other corridors branched off, but the path forward was always clear, lit by the gentle glow from the walls. Dr. Price said quietly that she was counting environmental adjustments because the temperature had shifted 3 times, and the air pressure had been adjusted twice, and the oxygen content was now almost exactly like Earth. She said the corridor was reading them and adapting. Watson observed that the aliens wanted them comfortable, which was something good at least, but Jake countered that maybe the aliens wanted them relaxed and not thinking clearly. The corridor finally ended at another massive door covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when Jake looked at them. Without warning, the door split down the middle and pulled back into the walls, revealing the chamber beyond. Jake had expected something impressive, but what he saw defied his expectations completely, because the council chamber was a giant sphere at least 200 meters across, with their entrance opening onto a platform that extended into the space. Above and below and all around them were other platforms, each occupied by beings that were definitely not human. Lieutenant Foster breathed beside him and said something that sounded like a prayer, because there were dozens of them, and creatures that ranged from almost human-looking to completely alien. Jake's eyes jumped from one to another, trying to process the variety. There was a being made of crystal structures that bent light through its body, and another that seemed to float inside a sphere of liquid that moved with it. Something had too many arms to count quickly, and another was all wings and looked like it might blow away in a breeze. Other creatures defied any description Jake could think of. Every single one of them was staring at the human group, and the weight of their attention felt physical. A voice boomed through the chamber in perfect English saying, "Welcome, representatives of Earth." Jake traced it to a platform directly across from them where a being that looked somewhat like a reptile sat in what might be a position of authority. Its scales shimmered with colors that reminded Jake of oil on water, and its eyes were huge and golden. The creature said it was Counselor Vexthar, and it was first speaker of the Galactic Council, and they had waited for humanity's arrival with great interest. Ambassador. Watson stepped forward to the edge of the platform, and Jake had to admire her composure because she showed no fear. Despite being confronted with dozens of alien species all at once, she said she was Ambassador Claire Watson, representing the people of Earth and the human species, and they were honored by the invitation and grateful for this opportunity to establish diplomatic relations. A sound rippled through the chamber that might have been laughter or might have been something else, and Jake's hand twitched again toward his absent weapon. Vexthar repeated the words diplomatic, relations, and there was something in the alien's tone that made Jake nervous. Vexthar asked if that was what humans believed this meeting was, and Watson didn't hesitate, saying the aliens invited humans to a peace meeting. So humans came in the spirit of establishing mutual understanding and cooperation. Another voice said, coming from a platform to their left where something that looked like a floating jellyfish pulsed with light. It said the council invited humans because they had no choice, and humanity had stumbled into the galaxy like a child stumbling into a room full of armed warriors. Jake felt his jaw tighten because this wasn't going the way any of them hoped it would. Watson said carefully that humans didn't understand because Earth only just achieved faster-than-light capability and established research outposts on 3 systems and encountered no other species and made no hostile actions. If humans violated some boundary or law, they were unaware it existed. Vexthar said the word unaware, and it seemed to echo through the chamber. The first speaker said yes, that was precisely the problem, because humans were unaware of the treaties that governed the galaxy and unaware of the zones established to prevent conflict and unaware of the dangers lurking in space and, most importantly, unaware of what humans actually were. That last statement hung in the air like a threat, and Watson glanced back at Jake, and he could see confusion in her eyes that matched what he felt. Watson asked what they were, because humans were a species that evolved on Earth and achieved spaceflight, and were taking first steps into the broader galaxy. What else would they be? A different voice spoke now, coming from a being that looked like it was made of liquid metal, constantly flowing and reshaping. It said humans were predators and apex, predators from a death world, and humans had no idea what that meant to the rest of them. The term death world sent a chill down Jake's spine, because he heard it before in science fiction stories but never thought anyone would apply it to Earth. Dr. Price stepped forward, and her scientific curiosity apparently overrode her caution. She said she didn't understand because Earth was a garden world with liquid water and breathable atmosphere and stable climate. It was ideal for life. The crystalline being said, its voice like wind chimes, that Earth was ideal for human kind of life. It said human world had gravity that would crush most species in this chamber and atmosphere with oxygen content, toxic to many of them, and oceans, filled with predators that hunted and killed for hundreds of millions of years. Even human plants produced toxins as defense mechanisms, and humans evolved at the top of the most savage food chain these aliens had ever documented. Jake looked around the chamber, seeing the other species with new understanding, and he wondered how many came from worlds with lighter gravity, and how many evolved as prey species instead of predators, and how many reached the stars without ever developing the instinct to hunt and fight and survive against creatures that wanted to eat them. Watson said firmly that humans didn't come to threaten anyone and came because aliens invited them. If human existence was somehow problematic, then help humans understand why. Vexthar leaned forward on the platform, and those golden eyes fixed on Watson with intensity that was almost physical. The first speaker said 17,000. Years ago, another species from a death world joined the galactic community, and they too were apex predators, and they too evolved through conflict and survival, and they too claimed to come in peace. Vexthar paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. The first speaker continued, saying within 2 centuries, those aliens had conquered 43 worlds and enslaved 14 species. It took the combined might of the entire Galactic Council to stop them, and even then it was close. The scars of that war were still visible on worlds throughout the galaxy, and the species destroyed by them were still mourned, and now here humans stood as another death world, species offering diplomatic relations, as if the Council had any reason to believe humans wouldn't follow the same path. Jake felt the weight of history pressing down on him because every species in this chamber was looking at humanity not as newcomers to be welcomed, but as potential threats to be contained. Watson said quietly that humans were not them, and whoever those aliens were and whatever they did, humans were not them. Humanity had its own history of conflict. Yes, and fought wars and made mistakes and caused suffering, but humans also learned and grew and built a civilization that valued peace and cooperation. Humans were here because they wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, not to dominate or conquer. The jellyfish being pulsed and said words because the other species said similar words and had treaties and laws and high-minded ideals, and then they discovered how easy it was to take what they wanted from species that never evolved to fight. Commander Garcia, who had been silent until now, spoke up saying, "So, what was the alternative? Would the council contain humans and try to prevent them from expanding beyond their own system? Because that wouldn't work. Eventually humans would find a way past whatever barriers were put in place, and then the council would have confirmed every fear by treating humans as enemies before they did anything to deserve it." Vexthar said slowly that the alternative was that they destroy humanity now before humans became a threat the council couldn't handle. It had been proposed and debated, and some on this council believed it was the only logical course of action. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop, and Jake saw Watson's face go pale, and he felt his own blood turn to ice because they walked into a trial and the verdict might already have been decided. Watson said with a steady voice, despite what must be overwhelming fear that the council would commit genocide, based on what another species did 17,000 years ago, and based on the possibility that humans might become a threat. That wasn't justice and wasn't even logical. That was fear-making decisions. The metal being flowed and said, "Fear keeps species alive, and fear is rational when the threat is real." Watson insisted that humans were not a threat. Not yet and not ever if given the chance to prove it. The council was judging humans for crimes they hadn't committed and for actions they never took. Was that really the kind of justice the council represented? Vexthar's expression was unreadable, but the first speaker's next words were measured. Vexthar said Watson misunderstood the purpose of this meeting because the council did not invite humans to judge whether they were a threat. They invited humans to deliver an ultimatum. Humanity would accept the terms set forth, or humans would be forcibly contained, and those were the only options. Jake felt his muscles tense because this was it. This was the moment that would determine humanity's future among the stars. Watson asked what were these terms. Vexthar said humans would hear them, but first there was something they must see that would help them understand why the council couldn't take the risk of another death world. Species running unchecked through the galaxy. The lights in the chamber dimmed, and holographic displays materialized in the center of the sphere. Images began to play, showing worlds burning and cities collapsing and species fleeing in terror from something humans couldn't quite see in the footage. Vexthar narrated, saying, "This is what the last Death World species did, and this is the legacy they left behind, and this is why when humans entered the galaxy, every alarm." The holographic images hung in the air like ghosts, and each one showed destruction on a scale Jake had never imagined possible. Cities that once touched the sky were reduced to rubble, and forests that stood for thousands of years turned to ash, and oceans boiled away, leaving cracked earth behind. Through it all were brief glimpses of the species that did this, called the Kreshtar, who were tall and powerful with 4 arms and armor-like skin that evolved to withstand predators that must have been nightmares. Vexthar continued, saying the Kreshtar came claiming friendship and shared technology and established trade and even married with some species. For 30 years they were model citizens of the galactic community, and then they attacked. The images shifted, showing military vessels unlike anything in Earth's arsenal and ships that seemed designed not just to defeat enemies, but to terrify them. The crystalline being added, its voice resonating with old pain, saying the Kreshtar were faster than council species and stronger and more adaptable, while council species evolved on worlds where cooperation was key to survival. The Kreshtar evolved through constant competition. Every instinct they had was honed for dominance. And when they decided to take what they wanted, the council discovered that all their civilization and technology and unity meant nothing against a species forged in the crucible of a death world. "Doctor," Price spoke up with emotion in her voice, saying, "But the council stopped them because Vexthar said it took the combined might of the council. But they stopped the Kreshtar, the liquid metal being flowed and set at a cost. 16 species were rendered extinct and 32 worlds were sterilized and billions died. Even now, 17,000 years later, there were regions of the galaxy that remained unsafe because of weapons the Kreshtar deployed that the Council still didn't fully understand. They stopped the Kreshtar, yes, but it nearly destroyed the Council in the process. The images faded and lights slowly returned to normal, and Jake could see the faces of the alien delegation around him, and in each one he recognized the same expression, which was trauma. These beings were still haunted by a war that ended thousands of years before some of them were even born. Ambassador Watson's voice was quiet when she spoke, saying she understood their fear truly. But humans were not the Kreshtar, and couldn't change what they did or undo the suffering they caused, but humans could choose their own path. Humanity had its own history of violence, yes, but also showed capacity to learn from mistakes. Humans built international bodies to prevent war and created laws to protect the innocent and chose again and again to be better than their worst instincts. Vexthar challenged Watson, asking, "Have you really? Because human history was filled with genocides and slavery and warfare between their own kind. Humans had nuclear weapons for less than a century and came perilously close to destroying themselves multiple times." Watson spoke of choosing to be better, yet human species was still divided into competing nations and still fighting over resources and territory. What made humans think they would behave differently when the stakes were entire worlds instead of patches of ground on one planet? It was a fair point, and Jake knew it, because humanity's history was not pretty when examined closely. But humans had changed, hadn't they? The world wars were nearly 2 centuries in the past, and nuclear weapons were mostly dismantled. And the United Earth government, while imperfect, had prevented major conflicts for decades. But would that matter when humanity encountered alien species? And would those same cooperative instincts hold when competing for resources with beings that weren't human, and didn't look human, and didn't think like humans? Watson said she couldn't promise perfection, because no one could, but she could promise effort. Humanity didn't come out here looking for conquest, but came looking for knowledge and new frontiers, and the chance to learn if they were truly alone. Now humans knew they were not alone, and knew there was an entire civilization with its own rules, and history and traumas, and humans wanted to be part of that, not as conquerors but as students and as new members who had much to learn. The jellyfish being pulsed, saying noble words, but words didn't erase biological reality, because humans were predators, and that didn't change because they wished it so. Human reflexes and instincts and psychology all geared toward dominance and survival through force. How could the Council trust that humans wouldn't revert to those instincts when pressure was applied? Lieutenant Foster stepped forward, and her analytical mind was clearly working through the problem. She asked if she could ask a question. Foster asked if Death World species were such a threat. Then how did the Kreshtar get access to advanced technology in the first place? The Council said the Kreshtar shared technology, which implied they had technology to share. So did they develop it independently, or did someone give it to them? There was a long pause, and Jake saw several alien beings exchange what might have been glances. Though it was hard to tell with such different bodies, Vexithar finally admitted the Kreshtar developed it independently and achieved spaceflight on their own and reached their moon and established colonies in their system, and then developed faster than light travel. When they made first contact with the Council, they were already a spacefaring civilization. Foster pressed, saying just like humans, which meant the problem wasn't that Death World species were inherently more violent or dangerous. The problem was that any species with drive and intelligence to achieve spaceflight on their own was going to be a potential threat. The Kreshtar didn't become dangerous because they were from a Death World, but became dangerous because they chose to use their capabilities for conquest. But that was a choice, not a biological imperative. The crystalline being countered, saying, a choice influenced by biology because human species evolved as pursuit predators, who could run down prey over long distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. Humans had vision optimized for tracking movement and hands adapted to grip weapons and tools and social structures built around hierarchies of dominance. All of this shaped how humans thought and reacted and interacted with others. Commander, Garcia let out a short laugh that sounded frustrated, saying the aliens could say the same thing about tool use or language or any other trait that made humans successful. Yes, humans were predators, but also caregivers who spent years raising young and social creatures, who formed complex communities and artists and scientists and philosophers. Humans were not just one thing, and reducing them to predators from a death world ignored all the complexity that made humans who they were. Vexthar said coldly that complexity didn't matter when you were the one being hunted, and the argument was going in circles. Jake could feel frustration building in the human delegation because they were trying to defend humanity against charges based on what another species did thousands of years ago, trying to prove a negative and trying to convince traumatized civilizations they weren't about to repeat history, and it was an impossible task. Jake heard himself say perhaps they were approaching this wrong, and was surprised when everyone turned to look at him because he had been content to observe and guard, but the tactical part of his brain analyzed the situation and reached a conclusion. Watson said, carefully asking what he was thinking. Jake said, keeping his voice level and calm, that this entire conversation was based on fear of what humans might do, and you couldn't prove a negative. Humans couldn't prove they wouldn't become a threat any more than the Council could prove they wouldn't suddenly decide to attack Earth tomorrow, because trust had to be built, not argued into existence. Vexthar said the Council didn't have the luxury of building trust slowly, because human species was expanding and already established outposts in 3 systems. How many more would there be in 5 years or 10 or 20? The Council couldn't wait to see what humans would become, and must act now while containment was still possible. Jake repeated the word containment, saying the Council kept using it and asking what it actually meant. Were they planning to blockade human system and destroy any ship that tried to leave, or something more permanent? The silence that followed was answer enough, and Dr. Price said barely above a whisper that the Council was actually considering destroying Earth with billions of people and an entire living world and a whole civilization. They were discussing genocide as if it was a reasonable policy option. The metal being said with something like regret in its voice that it wasn't what they wanted, but it may be what was necessary. One species, however numerous, versus the safety of hundreds of species across thousands of worlds. The mathematics of morality were harsh. Watson said sharply, with anger finally in her tone, that the mathematics were a lie, because the Council wasn't talking about mathematics, but talking about murder on an unimaginable scale, because they were afraid. Because 17,000 years ago they made a mistake in trusting the wrong species, and now wanted to punish humans for it. Vexthar corrected, saying, the Council made the mistake of waiting too long, and made the mistake of believing civilization could overcome biology. They made the mistake of thinking that because the Kreshtar spoke of peace, they would maintain it and the Council would not make that mistake again. Jake asked, so that's it, and asked if the Council already decided, and this whole meeting was just theater, before dropping whatever weapon. The platform beneath the human delegation began to move and retracted back toward the entrance. Jake looked around the chamber one last time, seeing the assembled species watching them with expressions he couldn't read. There was fear, yes, and suspicion certainly, but also perhaps curiosity and maybe, just maybe, hope that humanity could be different. The door sealed behind them and they were alone in the corridor once more. Garcia asked if they just agreed to put humanity under permanent surveillance, and Watson replied they agreed to whatever it takes to keep Earth from being destroyed. They could worry about details of implementation later, but right now they needed to focus on the fact they were still alive and Earth was still intact, and that was a win. However, Small Jake pointed out it wasn't a win until the Council actually agreed to it, because for all they knew, the aliens were in there right now deciding the best way to sterilize human planet. Watson said then they wait and hope, because hope was all they had left. They were led to a smaller chamber clearly designed for non-Council members. It was comfortable enough with seating that adjusted to human proportions and displays showing views of the station's exterior. Jake watched ships come and go with vessels of designs he couldn't begin to understand, and each one represented a species that made it to the stars and survived long enough to join this Council. Would humanity join them, or would this be the last view any human ever had of the broader galaxy before it was taken away forever? The wait was terrible and hours passed with no word. The human delegation tried to remain calm and tried to plan for various scenarios, but uncertainty gnawed at them all. Jake found himself pacing, unable to settle because his military training screamed they were in enemy territory with no weapons and no backup. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only 4 or 5 hours, the door opened and a new being entered. This one was smaller than most they had seen, and vaguely cat-like in appearance, with fur that shimmered between silver and gold. The being said in accented but clear English that the council reached a decision, and humans were to return to the chamber. But first the being was asked to convey a message to Ambassador Watson. From those who argued for giving human species a chance, Watson asked what message. The being said simply to prove us right because there were those who believed any species capable of reaching the stars earned the right to try. But if humans failed and if they became what the council feared, it would not just be humanity that suffered, but all who believed in them, and the blood would be on their hands as much as human hands. Watson promised humans wouldn't fail, and the being replied sadly that the Kreshtar said the same thing. The being said to come because the council awaited. They returned to the council chamber to find it transformed with platforms moved forming a more traditional semicircle around a central space where the human delegation now stood. The lighting had changed as well, focusing on Vexthar, who stood at the center of the council's arc. The first speaker announced the Galactic Council had deliberated and reached a decision regarding human species and their place in the galaxy. Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest, because this was it and the moment that would determine everything. Vexthar's golden eyes swept across the human delegation, and in that moment Jake felt the weight of every choice humanity ever made pressing down on him. Every war and every peace treaty and every act of kindness and cruelty all led to this single point in time where 5 humans stood before an alien council and awaited judgment for their entire species. Vexthar began saying the council heard the arguments and weighed the dangers against the principles upon which this body was founded. They examined historical precedent and contemplated future consequences, and the decision was not unanimous, but it was final. The first speaker paused, and Jake realized he was holding his breath. Vexthar said humanity would be granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council, subject to terms and restrictions that would be outlined in detail. Human species would not be destroyed, nor would human expansion be permanently halted, but humans would be watched and measured and judged by their actions in the years to come. Jake felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, and beside him Dr. Price let out a breath that sounded like a sob, and Watson's face remained composed, but her hands were shaking. Vexthar continued with the term saying first humanity would accept presence of council, observers on Earth and all human colonies. These observers would have diplomatic immunity and unrestricted access to monitor humanity's military and scientific and governmental activities, and they would report directly to this council. Watson nodded and said humans accepted. Vexthar said second that human expansion beyond their current 3 systems would be restricted for a period of 50 Earth years. This probationary period would allow the council to assess whether humanity could coexist peacefully with other species, and extensions or early termination of this restriction would be considered based on demonstrated behavior. Jake saw Garcia wince at that because 50 years was a long time, almost 2 generations. But it was better than extinction. Watson said again, humans accepted. Vexthar said third that humanity would be required to share all military technology and strategic capabilities with the council, including weapons, systems and defensive technologies, and any research into advanced physics that could have military applications. This information would be used to assess threat levels and ensure compliance with galactic law. That one was going to be harder to sell back home because no nation liked revealing military secrets on Earth only recently, unified enough to consider itself a single entity in space. But again, the alternative was worse. Watson said humans accepted, though Jake could hear strain in her voice. Vexthar said fourth that human vessels would be restricted from entering established territories without explicit permission from the governing species of those territories, and violation of this restriction would be considered an act of war and would result in immediate military response. Watson replied, understood and accepted. Vexthar said fifth that humanity would provide reparations to the species affected by the Kreshtar War. While humans were not responsible for their actions, this gesture would demonstrate human commitment to the galactic community and provide tangible support to civilizations still recovering from that conflict. Dr. Price leaned close to Watson and whispered something Jake couldn't hear, and Watson nodded before speaking. She said humans accepted, though they would like clarification on what form these reparations should take and over what time period they should be delivered. Vexthar said details would be negotiated, but the principle was established. Vexthar said finally humanity would be required to limit its population growth because the galactic ecosystem couldn't support unlimited expansion of any species, particularly those from high-gravity worlds with resource-intensive requirements. That last term sent a chill through Jake because population control had always been a contentious issue on Earth, tangled up with human rights and religious beliefs and national sovereignty. Asking humanity to accept externally imposed limits was asking for political chaos. Watson hesitated for the first time and said that term required clarification because humans needed to understand what limits the Council was proposing and how they would be implemented in a way that respected human autonomy and dignity. Vexthar said the details would be worked out, but the principle was non-negotiable because unchecked population growth had destabilized the galaxy before and it would not be permitted to do so again. Watson looked back at her team and Jake could see calculation happening behind her eyes because this was the line and the point where accepting might cost her the support of Earth's governments, but refusing might cost humanity its future. Watson said carefully they would bring this term to their government for consideration, and she couldn't accept it without broader consultation as it affected fundamental rights and freedoms that were core to human civilization, but she would advocate for finding a solution that satisfied both the Council's concerns and human values. For a long moment, Vexthar said nothing, and Jake wondered if they just threw away everything by refusing to accept all terms without question. But then the first speaker nodded slowly and said that was acceptable. The other terms would be implemented immediately, and the population control measures would be negotiated over the next 5 Earth years with understanding that a solution must be reached or the provisional membership would be revoked. Watson said agreed. Vexithar declared then it is done and humanity was hereby granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council. Welcome, children of Earth, to the community of worlds, and may you prove worthy of the chance you have been given. The chamber erupted in sounds that might have been applause or might have been something else entirely. Jake couldn't tell if the other species were celebrating or lamenting the decision, but it didn't matter because they had done it. Against all odds, despite the fear and suspicion, and despite the weight of history and shadow of the Kreshtar, they convinced the Council to give humanity a chance. The platform began moving again, carrying them back toward the entrance, but this time they were joined by several other beings. The cat-like alien who spoke to them earlier stepped forward, accompanied by a being that looked like it was made of interwoven vines, and another that Jake couldn't quite focus on as if it existed, slightly out of phase with normal space. The feline alien said it was Counselor Miraseth, and would be one of the primary liaisons between humanity and the Council. These were Counselor Thornvek and Counselor Phaserin, and they three argued most strongly for giving human species this opportunity. Watson thanked them, and Jake could hear genuine emotion in her voice saying humans wouldn't let them down. Thornvek said with a rustling voice like leaves that they should see that they don't, because they put their own reputations at risk by supporting humans. If humanity proved to be another Kreshtar, their species would bear the blame for allowing it to happen. Dr. Price asked why they supported humans if they didn't mind her asking, because the aliens barely knew humans. Phaserin said in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, that the alternative was to become what they feared, to destroy a species based on possibility rather than reality, and to let fear dictate actions rather than principle. The Galactic Council was founded on the belief that all species, deserving of reaching the stars, deserved a place among them, and if they abandoned that principle because of fear, they would have lost what made them worth preserving. Garcia observed that was remarkably idealistic for a galactic civilization, and Miraseth replied that idealism was all that separated civilization from chaos. The Kreshtar forgot that, and let their survival instincts override their higher principles, and the Council couldn't allow fear to make them do the same. They reached the hangar where the human shuttle waited, but before they could board, Vexthar appeared moving with surprising speed for such a large being. The first speaker said, "Ambassador Watson, a word, if you may," and Watson nodded. The two of them moved a short distance away, speaking in tones too quiet for Jake to hear. He watched them carefully, trying to read body language across species lines, but it was impossible to tell what was being said. When Watson returned, her expression was troubled. Jake asked quietly what Vexthar wanted, and Watson replied to give her a warning. Watson said the first speaker was one of those who voted against giving humans this chance, and Vexthar believed humans would eventually prove to be a threat. When that happened, the response would be swift and final, with no more negotiations and no more chances and just elimination. Foster muttered optimistic, and Watson corrected, saying realistic. Humans needed to understand they were walking a tightrope, and one major incident, or one act of aggression, or one sign they were becoming what the aliens feared, and everything ended. Not just for the delegation, but for Earth and for humanity. The shuttle lifted off, leaving the station behind, and Jake watched through the window as the impossible structure receded into the distance. They succeeded in their mission and saved humanity from destruction, and opened the door to the stars. But they also put humanity under a microscope, and made them the subject of constant scrutiny, and promised to limit their growth and freedom in ways that would be deeply unpopular back home. Garcia asked how they were going to sell this to Earth, and Watson said honestly, they would tell them exactly what happened and explain the fears and the restrictions and the consequences of failure, and then trust them to make the right choice. Dr. Price asked quietly, and if they don't? If Earth's governments rejected the terms, and if people demanded they refuse the restrictions? Watson said bluntly, then they would have a civil war on their hands, because accepting these terms was the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. Watson said some people would understand that, but others would see it as surrender and as weakness and as unacceptable limitation of human freedom. Jake observed they might have saved humanity from aliens only to tear themselves apart arguing about it. Watson said with a tired smile, that's humanity for you, because humans had always been their own worst enemy, and the question was whether they could be their own best friend too. The shuttle docked with the horizon, and Captain Hayes was waiting for them with his face tight with concern. He asked without delay if they were at war, and Watson said no. They were at peace, with conditional and restricted and heavily monitored peace, but peace nonetheless. Hayes let out a breath, saying that was better than he expected, honestly. He said to come on because they needed to get the team back to Earth. They had a lot of explaining to do and not much time to do it, because the fleet was already on alert, waiting for word on whether they were about to be attacked. As they made their way through the ship, Jake found himself thinking about what they learned in that council chamber. Humanity wasn't alone, but they also weren't welcome. They were tolerated and watched and suspected of being monsters waiting to happen. The irony was that in many ways the council was right to be afraid, because humanity did have violent instincts and did have a history of conflict and were predators evolved on a world that made them tough and adaptable and dangerous. But humans were also more than that, because they were explorers and dreamers and scientists and artists and people who could look at the stars and want to reach them, not to conquer but to understand. The question was which side of humanity would win out in the end. Would they prove the Council's fears wrong, or would they become exactly what Vexthar believed them to be? Jake didn't know, but he knew the answer would determine not just humanity's future among the stars, but whether they had a future at all. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and in that time the crew of the Horizon existed in a state of suspended anxiety. They sent preliminary reports ahead with coded transmissions that outlined the basics of what happened at the Council station, but the full implications wouldn't be clear until they returned and the diplomatic team could brief Earth's leadership in person. Jake spent most of the journey reviewing recordings of the meeting and analyzing every word and every gesture, trying to understand the alien mindset that put humanity on trial before they even committed a crime. The more he watched, the more he understood their fear, but understanding didn't make it easier to accept. Lieutenant Banks found him in the observation lounge on their 15th day out from the station and said he was going to drive himself crazy. Banks said she saw him watch those recordings 100 times, and Jake replied he was trying to see what he missed, because there had to be something there, some angle they didn't consider, or some argument that would have worked better. Banks said he got them provisional membership and kept Earth from being destroyed, and that wasn't nothing. Jake said it was also not enough, because provisional membership with restrictions that were going to cause massive political backlash meant they might have bought Earth time, but also might have started a civil conflict that tears them apart from within. Banks settled into the seat next to him, looking out at the stars streaming past as the horizon traveled through faster than light space. She said people would understand because they would have to, since the alternative was too terrible to consider. Jake asked will they, and told her to think about it. They were telling humanity they couldn't expand beyond 3 systems for 50 years and had to share military secrets with aliens they just met and had to accept permanent surveillance and might have to accept population control. How many people were going to see that as reasonable precautions versus unacceptable surrender? Banks insisted the ones who understood what was at stake would accept it. The ones who realized humans weren't negotiating from strength. Humans were the newcomers and the unknowns and the species that scared everyone else. So they take what they can get and prove themselves worthy of more. Jake said he hoped she was right because he really did. Earth appeared on the view screen 3 weeks after they left the council station. That familiar blue sphere that held everything humanity ever knew. Looking at it, Jake felt the weight of what they were returning with. Knowledge that would change everything in terms that would reshape human civilization, and the warning that failure meant extinction. The horizon was directed to land at United Earth Government headquarters in Geneva, where an emergency session of the Global Assembly had been convened. As the shuttle descended through atmosphere, Jake could see crowds gathered and news drones circling and millions of people waiting to hear what humanity learned about its place in the universe. Garcia muttered this was going to be a circus, but Watson corrected, saying, this was going to be history because whatever happened next, they were the ones who brought it here. They were met on the landing pad by Secretary General William Cooper, who was head of United Earth Government, along with military chiefs and scientific advisors and a crowd of officials Jake couldn't begin to identify. Cooper was a tall man with white hair and a face that had seen every political crisis Earth faced in the past decade. He said, "Welcome home, Ambassador Watson," and said he trusted she had quite a story to tell them. Watson replied more than he could imagine, and less time to tell it than they would like because the council would be sending observers within the month and humans needed to be ready. Cooper said then they better get started because